Can we bring the meeting to order, please? Thank you. Apologies, first of all.
Councillor Carty, Councillor Caserta and Councillor Lewis.
And then we've got two substitutes, Councillor Ray Dutton and Councillor Kevin McKeon. And yet again, I do really applaud, if you like, the substitutes for stepping into the breach. And some of you do a lot of work, perhaps occasionally more than some of the members of the committee. So you are very much welcome here, actually. Thank you. We've also got apologies from the portfolio leader, Councillor Andrew Weston and Councillor Linda Thomas, and also the portfolio lead chief executives, Tony Oakman and Donna Hall. They've all sent their apologies. Now, I think in the past, we probably haven't had meetings in August, and probably people do book holidays in August. So, you know, on this occasion, you know, I think that I'm sure there are very valid reasons why they're not here. But I do think, you know, it's very, very important meetings going forwards. And I know it's going to be the odd thing with September, so because some executives take leave in September to miss the school holidays. It is important that the leads come to this meeting. So can we make sure that there's a really good reason if they can't come? Because I think it's important that we hear their views, that they've taken the responsibility. And I have to say, last year and before that, actually, the portfolio holders were very, very good by and large in attending. So that's that. There are no chair's announcements or urgent business. In terms of the items on the agenda, are there any declarations of interest? Thank you. But can I also remind members, there are 4 outstanding declarations of interest for the GMCA. Now, it may just be that perhaps people missed the first meeting, because there's a requirement not just to do your declaration of interest at your local council level, but also do a specific one as well for the GMCA. So I think Emma's been chasing those. So if there's any person here today who is in that position, if you could fill your forms out and give them to Emma, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Can I just say, yes, it's a register of interest forms like you just submit for your local council, so we just need one for the CA as well, if that's okay. Thank you very much.
Can we next consider the minutes of the meeting that was held on the 13th of July? And are there any comments on the minutes? There are a couple of minor typos which we've picked up, and we'll amend those on the final version. But I don't propose to go through those now, actually. There's only 2 of them, in fact.
Move the minutes, Chair.
Right, so can we approve those in, please? Thank you. And then the first substantive item now on the agenda is the GMCA Culture and Social Impact Fund. And that's going to be Alison Gordon, who's the Assistant Director of Business Innovation and Enterprise Policy at GMCA.
Thank you, Chair. Can I first of all introduce my colleague, Mary Claire Daly? We'll try and do a double act between us. And can I first of all, can we all congratulate ourselves on the fact that Manchester is the most livable city in the UK, identified today, this week rather, by the Economic Intelligence Unit. We would argue one of the reasons for that is because of our strong cultural offer and the recognition of just how important culture is to Greater Manchester. So that's my plug. The last time we brought something on the Culture and Social Impact Fund to Scrutiny was November last year, where we took your views on the process that we were going to use to be able to identify those applications, that the application process and the decision-making process. What we are able to do today is to be able to update you on those applications that have been successful and to give you a little bit of background on those. We also wanted to update you on the new governance around the culture portfolio. You'll recall that the culture portfolio is relatively new. So what we've done is quite a bit of work looking at being able to get the very best governance we can for that. And then also to be able to share with you and get your input on the development work that we're doing on creating a new Greater Manchester strategy around culture. So what I wasn't going to do, unless you want me to, is to go through this line by line. If you are fine that I assume that you've read it, and what I'll do is just go through the headlines. In terms of the Culture Fund, we went out for applications last autumn. We had a phenomenal response to it. We had 87 applications into the fund. The fund is a 2-year fund starting from April this year. The 87 applications we had added up to just short of £15 million worth of funding. So what we did was we had a application criteria and a criteria for being able to identify which projects should go forward. The criteria that we used was based upon just the stability of the organisation, first of all, but also the contribution that the organisation would make to the profile of Manchester, Greater Manchester, locally, nationally and internationally, to the contribution it would make in terms of skills and employability of residents, to be able to develop strong and resilient communities, and to be able to make a positive contribution to health and well-being, all of which we felt were critical that our cultural offer was able to do that. One of the other things that was really, really important was geography of delivery. What we wanted to be able to see was as great a coverage as we possibly could across Greater Manchester. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. In terms of how many organisations we funded, having gone through that process, we funded 28 organisations, 11 of which are new to the portfolio, which is lovely to see. You may remember this cultural fund replaced an old GMCA, old AGMA rather, Section 48 fund. All organisations that were funded under that previous fund who applied have been funded, although some of them to a lower level. And in part that was so we could expand the portfolio, but we tried to do it in a way that those organisations that received the largest amount of funding had a slight cut off the top, that were more able to be able to handle that kind of cut rather than those smaller organisations. And that allowed us to be able to build the portfolio. What the portfolio has done, it's meant we've been able to see new investment in new places across Greater Manchester. So we've been able to increase investment in Rochdale and in Salford, and for the first time being able to fund an organisation in Wigan, which is hugely positive. We've been able to look to support our organisations across different art forms, some for the first time as well. And one of the things that we've been able to do is invest more in digital arts and culture. And again, that has a direct contribution to our digital ambitions as well. In terms of the impact assessment around the investment, it was described as moderately positive, which sounds a little bit disappointing. Actually, that's positive when you consider the scale of investment that's gone into this. The overall investment is just short of £7 million. If we are putting more in it, it would be more positive, but overall it's positive, which is very good. We've gone through quite a detailed process to make sure that we heard quite a bit of criticism under the old programme that beneficiaries often landed in places with relatively little consultation with local areas and with local arts officers. We've been very, very careful in contracting with organisations that their funding is in part structured around their engagement with local arts officers. So what we have is it gives local areas an ability to be able to align activity to potentially get more impact, but just to make sure that somebody doesn't land and local areas are not aware of that. And that felt a very important thing to do. In terms of where the investment's gone, the vast majority of applications were from the City of Manchester. However, one of the things that's really important to note is that 89, just short of 90% of all the applicants, all of the recipients rather, will deliver across Greater Manchester. So although the organisation might be based in the City of Manchester, they will be working across Greater Manchester. The benefit will be felt across the whole of Greater Manchester. There is a list of the organisations on here. I won't go through them all unless you have particular questions. I wanted to move on next, if that's okay, to the Culture Steering Group. As I mentioned, this is a new governance structure to be able to support the cultural portfolio. I've mentioned in the report those areas that the portfolio has responsibility for and the steering group will have responsibility for. One of those things is obviously the performance of the cultural fund that I've just talked about. The steering group is being chaired by the portfolio leader, Linda Thomas of Bolton. And what we've done is look to be able to bring representation from national public and private funders into culture and the arts, local culture arts networks, senior policy representation across a range of policy areas. And again, that's about culture not sitting by itself. It's about culture's contribution to the economic and social health of Greater Manchester. One of the things that we have looked at quite hard is how we get a resident voice into the steering group. It's going to be very, very hard to be able to identify one individual who can do that. But what we have is quite a lot of work ongoing to be able to identify and give residents a chance to be able to input to the cultural strategy that I'll talk about at a minute. But one of the things as well, one of the reasons that it's so important that we have political leadership of this group is actually that they are resident representation. We are happy to consider as we go through the development of the strategy if there is a better way to do this in terms of bringing residents forward. We absolutely will, but equally we're aware of the fact we also don't want to intimidate and overwhelm people asking them to represent everybody. But I will talk a little bit more about that, if that's okay, later on. The group membership is here. We've gone to quite a lot of trouble to make sure it's balanced in terms of gender, ethnicity and geography as well. And one of the first jobs of the steering group will be to provide some guidance and oversight of the cultural strategy that we're in the process of developing now. Again, in terms of the strategy, what this is not intended to be is a strategy that manages activity in every local authority. It's very much about where we can add value as Greater Manchester. It's not intended to replace local strategies or local activities. One of the things that we want to be able to do, and one of the pieces of work we've done, is to work with each local authority to understand what their priorities are, what their strategies and their cultural strategies say, to identify where there are common areas of interest and where we can potentially add value, or where those are areas where there are gaps, they would like to do something but are not able. So that's one of the areas that we're looking at in quite some detail at the moment. We're also looking at strategies across the country and also across cities across Europe as well, because we are working on the assumption that actually other places are quite good at this as well. Broadly, there are three priorities identified, which are around people, economy and place. That's probably not hugely surprising. We have to be able to kind of start to give us the structure of the strategy. We've spoken to about 70 cultural organisations and artists and experts. We are looking that the strategy will cover the first 5 years from next year. And one of the things that we want to be able to do is over the autumn to be able to do a really quite wide public consultation, particularly resident consultation, but being able to talk to some of those organisations and individual artists who've not been able to be involved up to now. And that feels that this, particularly for this strategy, it's really important that we're able to co-develop it as much as we can. There's three ways we're going to look to do the consultation. We're looking to do an open online consultation, and we're looking to be able to do something that's quite targeted at communities and residents, but then also to be able to look to piggyback on some of the cultural events that are going on across Greater Manchester at the moment. The steering group, as I've said, will have oversight of the strategy, and what we are looking to do is we are looking to bring it back to you, or we're looking to bring it to you rather than back to you, in December this year before it goes to the Combined Authority at the end of the year for adoption, hopefully from next April. I'm happy to take any questions.
Before I throw it out to question, can I make 2 observations? The first one is on page 22, and that is GM Arts, which has gone to Rochdale, which I thought was wonderful, being a councillor in Rochdale, was £632,000. But what it actually is money that's gone to our cultural trust, Link for Life, who act, if you like, as an organisation to divvy out, if you like, these funds. So the 632,000 has been spread across all of the boroughs in Greater Manchester. It's not come just to Rochdale. If it had done, I'd have been delighted, but it hasn't been. And I think it's been done this way in the past, in fact. But it would be helpful, perhaps, if it's possible, to let separately the individual representatives of each council know broadly how much is going to each of the councils. And secondly, I think the other thing which I also asked, which, to be fair, yesterday, and it will take time to get it, that in terms of the applications that have come in from the various boroughs, and for commercial reasons, or sensibly, I don't want the individuals listed, but it'd be very helpful to know, if you like, by number and value, what each council bid and what they actually got. And obviously, we do appreciate the point you made with a place like the Halley and so on, in terms of they service the whole of Greater Manchester as such. But I think that those 2 things will be very helpful, I think, for individual councillors to fully understand, if you like, how their own patch is being affected. Thank you. Right, so first of all, it's Mark and then Danny.
Thanks, Chair. Welcome the report. I think it's very important, obviously, that a report like this is coming to the Scrutiny Committee. It's very easy in the current economic climate, in particular when we're dealing with big issues about the need for economic regeneration and the fallout from Brexit, Chair, and all those other issues, to forget that this is an important issue in its own right. I just want to make 2 observations. I think it's a good report, and I welcome the additional comments that Alison has made. I particularly welcome the fact that the largesse is being spread a little wider this year, and that was a good point, well made. Of course, coming from Stockport, you'd expect me to say this, and I don't like to disappoint on these occasions, but it still isn't in every part of Greater Manchester. I think you've got 7 of the 10 districts getting something out of it, but Bury, Stockport and Trafford don't appear to be getting anything yet. So I'd like to know, the question is, what are the organisation doing, what's the Combined Authority doing proactively to engage with those areas that are still to... And I appreciate Mike's point earlier about the sum of money allocated to Rochdale, which has some benefit elsewhere. And this is not a gripe, let me make clear, about Manchester. That's the regional capital. That's where a lot of these organisations are based. And I certainly have no disagreement at all with the sums of money that are going to those kind of things. But I think none of us on this committee can rest easy until we're satisfied that the whole of the Combined Authority, the whole of the conurbation, is benefiting from it. So I'd like to, as I say, ask what proactively you're doing to engage with those 3 authorities, particularly that still don't have a specific benefit. And also on the steering group, you mentioned about the need to get, I think you referred to it as a public representative, a sort of consumer interest on there as well. And I would agree. I think that is critically important, difficult to do. I mean, who on earth can you approach to say, can you represent the whole community of Greater Manchester? But however difficult it is, again, I think it's a must do. And I'd like to know what so far you've done and perhaps what thoughts you have about the future proactively trying to get somebody on there, or perhaps more than one person, to represent what I would collectively refer to as consumer interest, because they are, they are arguably the most important voice and are not currently represented on there.
Alison,
thanks, Chair.
Before you answer that, can I bring Karen as well? Because Karen actually has raised a very similar point.
Yeah. My concern was that I thought it was very heavy. And I know they're the right people there, Alison, and I know that they are the people who know. And there didn't seem to be anybody from us, from the normal person who goes to the theatre or goes to these art festivals and things like that. And I was quite concerned at the time when I read this that there wasn't anybody on there. And I'm still concerned, and I hope that we can actually move on with that one. And I'm sure there are lots of people that would love to do it.
Alison.
So, thank you. If I part answer the question, then pass over to Marie Claire, who's got all of the detail. What I can say, which is good, is for both questions that have raised, we are addressing those. One of the things in terms of the geography of the applications, we tried to find a way to present this, and we've clearly not been able to do it very well. When an organisation applies, they have to be able to say where they're based. Now, for some, like the Halle, it's fairly obvious. But for some other organisations, their office space has been reported and they work across Greater Manchester. So what we have done, although a significant number of the organisations are based in Manchester, part of the contracting that we've done with them for what they're going to deliver over the next 2 years is that they actually get out of their base, if they're based in Manchester, and they get out to Rochdale, and they get out to Stockport and to Bury and to Trafford. One of the things that was hugely important is that the vast majority of investment that's gone into cultural activity will be across the whole of Greater Manchester, even if the organisation isn't based within those local authorities that look as though they've not got funding. There will be activity going on within there. It's just potentially organisations from that local authority didn't submit an application, or potentially it in the assessment of the application it wasn't ranked high enough when we had a constrained fund. But we can say a little bit more about that. Could I absolutely take your point about resident voice on the steering group. This is something we are acutely aware of. The challenge is, how do you identify those one or two individuals who can cover the whole range of art forms to be able to be able to speak on behalf of everybody, and that's something that's really challenging for us. But I was going to ask Marie Claire to talk a little bit about the process we're going through on the Cultural Fund and a project called Great Place that I think we mentioned in November, about getting community and resident input into Greater Manchester's cultural offer and where we might be able to get to a solution.
Hello, everybody. So in terms of the resident engagement, we've put together a programme of consultation, really, which kind of leads up throughout the autumn with a strategy consultation, but then continues on for 18 months. So it's a kind of 18-month programme of resident engagement. And so we start off with a very wide engagement, asking people what they love about their place, what they value, what they think culture is. These are all things that are going to go into the strategy development. Now, we've commissioned a video engagement specialists almost to go out and have those conversations. So at cultural organisations, at cultural events, but also where people might not necessarily be encountering culture. So how do you get to the people? You don't get to the people who aren't going to the theatre by going to a theatre, that kind of. So we'll be going to shopping centres, we'll be going to large public events, and through this wide, I think we've got at the very least 50 vox pops being done, so that's 5 per district, and hopefully more, but that's the kind of bare minimum. And through that, we're going to look through, and for each district, we're going to identify someone who is willing to, and who wants to go on a cultural journey with us for 18 months. So that will be one person from each district who really wants to get involved, and we will take them to different events of their choice. We will take them to some of our funded activity. We will film them and have ongoing conversations with them while they are going on this journey. And I think that what we would then do is ask who would like to come onto the steering group, and so have a representative on each of the different steering groups going forward. So what we're trying to do is take somebody who isn't really necessarily engaging with culture and show them not just the culture that is available, but also bring them in on the kind of decision making, policy making, so we have that voice. But that is going to be, while that is going to be represented on the steering group is just one part of it. We are going to be going on a much longer, more in-depth journey with these residents. So that's all the theory, and we will make it happen. But I think in the conversations with those residents, we'll find out how up for going on that journey people are, and maybe some people will want to be more involved than others, and I think we'll manage that as we go through.
Are you happy with that answer, Mark? Ish. I mean, I think as with all this, the proof of the pudding is in the eating.
Just come back briefly, Chair. I mean, it's good and positive that something is being done to address this, but I can't but out feel it all sounds a little bit, shall we say, hopeful. It's hopeful rather than, you know, a definite plan. And if you're going to do, I'm not quite clear. You talked about the vox pops and perhaps 5 in each area and everything. Well, it's well and good if you're going to stand in the shopping centre and all this, but you're just going to see if those people that are in that shopping centre that day. I'm not clear how the wider community might engage with it. And let's face it, I'm only using Stockport, Trafford and Bury as the specific examples for obvious reasons, but there are lots of people in those communities who are very interested in the arts and culture and are probably patrons of places like the Royal Exchange and the Halle. But you won't necessarily get them in Stockport if you stood outside Mersey Shopping Centre with the best will in the world. So I think I'm glad to see what you're proposing to do, but I think there's a bit more thinking needs to be done about how you accomplish this task. Anyway, thanks.
And that's one very specific part of the consultation process. We are also having specific events which will be open to all residents, so there will be one in each district. We're also having sector-specific conversations, so that will be, we will put a very, very public call out, and we will host, so for people who are, say, interested in music, we will hold a large open event where anybody from across the district, so there's going to be sector-specific conversations, district-specific conversations, online consultation so people can kind of speak as well, and then there's the kind of in-depth thing, so there are more things.
We'll come back to that at the end, actually.
Basically, mine was sort of the same as what Councillor Hunt was saying. My first comment is that obviously there's been a lot of investment into Rochdale of like £692,000, which is brilliant to see that coming into Rochdale. But it's like the first thing you said, you know, Manchester is like the best place to live, but Rochdale and Oldham are usually on the most deprived places in the country. And I would like to see that investment continue after the 2 years as well, because it's like you're saying, we are actually doing quite well now in Rochdale, continuing that promotion of arts and culture within Rochdale. And it actually leads on to what my actual question's about. And I am sorry if this question has been asked before, and you touched it as well, Councillor Hunter, was about funding. Where does the actual funding come from? Does it come all from the Arts Council? I don't want to start a Brexit debate with this, but does money come from the EU? Will there be less money in the future? What's the plan within the future after these 2 years?
If I can answer, the funding for the 2 years of the Cultural Fund comes from Greater Manchester, so it comes from local authorities.
But where does that money come from Greater Manchester then?
It comes from... So, no, it's local authority funding.
Oh, right.
It's local authority, so you've all paid for it, thank you.
Right. Kevin, then Jude, then Valerie, then Luke, and then Ray. Oh, sorry, yeah, go on, Danny, sorry. I thought you'd finished, apologies.
So, in regards to you, Manchester gets no money in regards to culture and arts, is that what you're saying?
So there's quite a complex funding matrix. So you have direct investment through organisations like the Arts Council. You have local authority level investment that you all know about. You have organisations who will apply to EU. So actually, I mean, I think it's about 200 million that comes into Greater Manchester from Arts Council. So this is Greater Manchester's investment, but in terms of the wider investment in culture, for this direct DCMS grants that come in, there are different pots of funding from different places, and that includes EU funding at the moment. So it's quite a complex picture. There's more than this 2 million.
I think it would be a question outside of the meeting that I'll ask.
Okay.
Just for clarity, I think what you're saying is that there's lots of extra funding that goes direct to these organisations, particularly organisations like the Harry, etc. So, and we're talking about then effectively a top-up. Some of it to large organisations, but a lot to smaller organisations. And I think that, as I said before, that I think this analysis of between individual boroughs will be helpful for Mark and Danny as well, for that matter. Yeah. Okay, so I'll say we've got Kevin next.
Thank you. It's a really exciting report, and so thank you for all the work you've done on it. A couple of points about governance and then a pedantic point at the end. The first one follows on from what you've been saying about involvement of the public, and given the difficulties of that kind of task, I think what you're saying is very, very positive. But I was wondering, would it be possible to have sitting underneath the steering group a kind of residents panel? Would that be something that might be thought about? But that's just a suggestion. And secondly, I'm interested to know about the recruitment process that went into forming the steering group. Was it a kind of old boys and old girls network, or did you have some criteria and put it out generally for application?
So, thank you. I think the idea of a residents panel is a really good idea, and that's something that we will take away. In terms of the membership of the steering group, what we didn't do is we didn't look to be able to recruit openly. We'd set some criteria about who we wanted to be able to engage, and that was to do with, first of all, looking at those national influencers on culture. That was really important that they understood. They got to know Greater Manchester better, and they got to know our ambition. That we were able to identify local cultural organisation networks, so we could find, and again, trying to find a limited number of people who could represent a broader sector. And then we wanted to be able to find a variety of people from different art forms and who we knew would have different issues that potentially wouldn't be represented in other ways. I'm trying to, have I missed? I don't think I've missed. We kind of set what would it need to look like to get as many voices as we can. What we then did was to be able to go out and to identify through our networks who those best people would be. So we didn't do an open recruitment because it kind of felt there was a specialist skill set that we needed, and we needed to be able to balance that across the whole of the steering group, if that answers your question.
Obviously, I understand that and I appreciate it, but it is still possible, isn't it, I think, to set up a set of criteria and then go to open recruitment. The problem when you're identifying people you know already is that there are people you don't know who might match that criteria. However, what's done is done. My final point is pedantry, perhaps, about definition of culture. I noticed that the Water Adventure Centre got a grant, and it's, I presume that's a sporting centre. I just wonder how that qualified.
So it's the Culture and Social Impact Fund. So it's basically some organisations weren't directly funded. So there's Greater Sport in there as well, who got quite significant, and that's for sporting activity. So the idea being that the portfolio is the culture, leisure and sport portfolio. So there was the ability to fund organisations who weren't just doing kind of culture, but who had significant social impact for residents in terms of well-being and health outcomes.
That's interesting, and thank you for that. But that kind of widens it up quite a lot, doesn't it? And once we get this out into lots of people could make applications, presumably. Yeah, is that true? Yeah. Is that true? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report. It was really interesting reading. Just for myself and my personal kind of perspective, I've kind of acknowledged the value that culture has, because I do a lot of work in communities, and I think it's a really important vehicle to support and support community cohesion. So that's my starting point. But I kind of note your priority areas, and I'm interested in how you're going to develop and extend that evidence base of evidence and the value added in terms of the fund, because it's obviously a significant amount of investment, and your priority areas are kind of older people, employment and families, etc. So, for example, how things like loneliness and isolation are big issues for Greater Manchester. So how will the providers that you're going to be working with evidence their impact, given my comment would be that a lot of the work that you've kind of funded is building based, and I acknowledge that you said that they've committed to working across Greater Manchester. So, but I think there's kind of some challenges with that when they are very much in buildings, and culture's much wider than that.
So in terms of the reporting and monitoring, we are asking them to report very closely to the 4 priorities. So how did you deliver against the skills, the community cohesion, the health and well-being? So they're being asked as a 6-monthly report to tell us exactly what they've done, where they've done those things, and we're going to bring all of that information together, have conversations with them where we perhaps don't think that the delivery is being done right. We're going to speak to the district arts officers, share these reports with them, and see if what the organisations are telling us marries up with what they are seeing on their kind of patch. And so that will happen at 6-month points, and then we will have an annual review point as well where we can report back. And we're also doing quite a lot of work with national partners on evidencing that social impact, and so there's a national conversation going on about how we get better as a sector evidencing the very hard impacts that we have. So we've got the kind of the GM stuff that we're doing, but we're also partnering nationally to try and answer that question, and we've got some good pilot things going on.
Valerie.
Thank you. I think my question follows on a little bit from that. You suggested that investments have been moderately positive. How do you know that?
And that was so the moderately positive was the equality impact assessment of the final portfolio. So basically, in deciding the portfolio, we went through and against the protected characteristics, but also against socioeconomic disadvantage. We looked at how based on what we were funding, what impact that would have. So obviously they've not reported yet. That is on the proposed delivery that we had. When we go forward in terms of monitoring the first 6 months, people are reporting in October, we'll be able to look at that. That the moderately positive was very specifically about the equality impact assessment of the portfolio.
I'm sorry. Perhaps my training as a statistician is kicking in here. I'd really like to understand a little bit more about what the assessment process itself involves. Are you doing surveys? Are you interviewing people? Are you looking at management statements? How?
There is a process and a template that we follow to do an equality impact assessment. And what we can do is we can share that template if it's useful. It's a kind of standard model that's used across a range of different local authorities, and it's to be able to make sure you are not and particularly because we were moving from an AGMA fund to a new fund and the portfolio changes, it's to make sure that you are very clear on if things are changing, if that's going to have an impact on residents' access to that investment, if you like. But we'll happily share the process.
Might I ask a follow-up question? I had not understood, and I'm sorry, I'm new to this committee, I had not understood that this money, which is quite a substantial amount of money, is coming from our own district budgets. And I wonder, therefore, whether we might not be a little bit more imaginative in supporting smaller scale enterprises. Why should we, from relatively poorer districts, invest in money to the Halle, for example? Yes, it's an excellent resource for all of us. I understand that. But we're contributing, as I understand the table on page 21 and 22, 8% of their budget, their total income. They can get money from other sources, and I'm sure they're quite well qualified to do that. What is the additional advantage for our money in making this contribution when so many local cultural and sporting activities are so underfunded?
If I could respond to that. The funding that we give them is to the Halle and the other organisations is to be able to provide cultural activity across Greater Manchester. So what we are doing is, for the Halle, for example, we are making a contribution to their budget, but what we want them to do is to take the Halle out of the Bridgewater Hall and to be able to take it out into Stockport and into Oldham and into Rochdale. So it's about being able to get those nationally and sometimes internationally leading organisations out into Greater Manchester. So it's not about people having necessarily to come into the Bridgewater, or even people who can't necessarily afford to be able to come into the Bridgewater. So it's about being able to push that activity out into areas. In terms of the funding that's gone to organisations, these are organisations who applied for funding. So we publicised the call for projects really, really widely. What we didn't do was go and kind of tap organisations on the shoulder and say, you need to apply for that. We wanted to be able to keep it fair and as level a playing field as we can. There is something about next time being able to locally encourage more organisations to be able to bid into this funding.
I'll just come back in there on one point, and I take your point entirely about trying to use some of this funding to get organisations like the Halle to go to other parts of the conurbation. But how, if they don't do that, what's the sanction?
So in the way it's set up is we have quarterly payments, and each payment is there are a series of conditions that they have to meet, and if for any reason, so if at the 6-month point when we have tested what they've said they are going to deliver with the local district arts officers and that is not sufficient, we can halt payment, we can negotiate, we can say actually could you work more closely with this particular area actually, so we have those kind of mechanisms in place.
Glad to hear that. The next question is from Luke.
Thank you. Yeah, one, maybe two. Depends how you define them. I'm looking at the steering group membership again, and I was wondering who represents the sort of rank and file performers. Now I can see there's a poet there, there's a writer, and there's a musician, but they seem to also be directors and producers and so on. And my concern is that I can't see, maybe I'm wrong, where the sort of rank and file performers are. People are particularly often quite badly treated sometimes. There are musicians' unions, there are performers' unions. Are they not considered to be worthy of this panel? The other question is similarly, who can represent the people who aren't engaged in the arts on this panel? Because those seem to be quite a key stakeholder.
So I think the first one, so we can provide biographies for full biographies for all of the members. And I think, so if you look at, say, Shirley May, who is down as a poet, she actually works with a poetry collective called Young Identity, and they are young people from across Greater Manchester who are kind of learning. So where somebody's title might be poet, actually underneath in terms of the networks they have, in terms of their sector leadership, almost the connections that they have with artists. So Kwong, for example, is down as a producer, but he is he's a practicing artist who's also based in one of our artist studios, so he's got a really big artist network. So there's been a lot of thought gone into the representation. And then I think in terms of that, the voice of the people who aren't engaging, that is one of our big challenges, and I think that's something that we are, over the next 18 months, going to try and get that in through the ways that we've spoken about. But I do think it needs a bit more thought.
Right, and then Barry.
Thank you, Chair. I apologise. Not used to these things working in Rochdale. Apologies for that. There's a couple of things which you've explained, like the percentages now, and I start to understand that. Now, all these organisations, I'm led to believe, are non-profit organisations. If you get an organisation like the Halley, it does make mega profit in the following 12 months, and we've given that percentage, which could have gone to smaller causes. Is there any claim-back facility? That's question one.
Very specifically, we are investing in them to do very specific activities, so their overall kind of profit that will not change the thing that we're asking them to do with the money. So they're very, very specific, that they will deliver this many sessions in these places, and that they will deliver these kind of choral activities, and there are participant numbers that they have agreed to. So I think the success of the Halley doesn't change the thing that we're investing in them to do.
I think it's, unless I'm much mistaken, there isn't a single organisation here with shareholder interest. And the day the Halley makes a profit, I'll eat my trousers, to be perfectly honest. I mean, they're barely keeping their head above water, if truth be told. So I think the issue of profit per se just doesn't arise. But there is, as Mary Claire has said, a very strict performance-related criteria to ensure that organisations are doing what they said they would do in the places they said they would do it in order to access payment.
Final question, really. There's obviously like 40, 50-ish bids that failed. I was just wondering what constructive feedback you give to those, so they may be more successful in a previous time.
I had 50 feedback conversations. I offered phone calls and meetings and coffees with every single unsuccessful, and I think around 50, well, between 40 and 50 took me up on it. We have good relationships with them all going forward, and we are engaging them in the strategy development. We are engaging them in all of the different ways that we are developing the portfolio. So we have tried very, very hard to reckon, because I mean, what I would say is that they were brilliant. There were so many good projects. They're not things that we don't want to find ways to work with them.
Thank you. Barry, next.
Thanks, Chair. I don't want to be parochial, really, because a lot of people in Trafford can get on the tram and be in central Manchester in 15 minutes anyway, but not all of them, but many of them can. But when we go back to our respective councils, we're going to be asked by colleagues about that list, and obviously people are going to look at that, and not just our colleagues, but people from the local groups, and they're going to ask the questions that's been asked here today, really. So I just wondered, I was glad to hear about the Halley. Unfortunately, I remember 30 years ago when we had the Section 48 grants, the same debate took place then, and the Halley has been the subject of that debate, I think, probably every year the last 30 years. But I was going to ask about them coming out. I'm glad that Valerie mentioned that, because I didn't really realise they actually did that. But it would be useful to know more positively, really, in future, when they're going to come out and where they're going to come out, because it's easy to make promises, but more difficult to keep them. So it would be, I think, a source of comfort to other people out there to know that the money is not just being spent in central Manchester, but others are going to benefit very directly from that. The other thing is, I think somebody mentioned about local groups. I'm sure we've all got in our borough local theatrical groups and choirs and all that, and most of them are struggling. So it would be in the future, I think, if some of the money could be just shaved off to support local talent and local groups, that would be a good thing, because they are, you know, they do work hard and they are very keen, more interested in culture than the average person, and to support them I think would be very welcome and valuable, rather than just supporting the major professional organisations. Thanks, yeah.
Just a very quick one. Once we have published the strategy, we are going to go out to consultation on what the investment package that will support delivery of that strategy will look like. So bearing in mind that in April 2020 this funding comes to an end, we're already going to be planning how we invest next year. So once we've got the strategy, we will then go out and find out what the best way to fund going forward is. So there will be public consultation on that as well.
If I could just come in as well, one of the things that's really, really important is that the investment that Greater Manchester puts in doesn't stand in isolation. And what we want to be able to do is to work with other funding organisations, whether that's local authorities or whether it's the Arts Council or even private philanthropists. What we want to do is to try and get to a position that actually when you add all those things up, which was the point made before, it's actually a considerable amount of money. And what we want to be able to do is to think about how can we do that a little bit more strategically, so we are able to support a wider range of organisations, both in terms of size and in terms of geography, if we all funders work together.
Hello, one more question. That's Danny.
Everyone's going to be sick of my voice by the end of this meeting, but it's just a quick one, really. You were talking about criteria to do the Halley. Is there a holistic criteria for every single funding that you've done here today? Because it's like you're saying, if, for example, it's gone to Rochdale, £632,000, is there a criteria there to say that they have to do something across Greater Manchester, like you were saying with the Halley, or is it actually just separate to Rochdale? The other thing as well was, I remember you were talking about leisure, and we were talking about obviously sports club being on here, but then when it's a Greater Manchester Cultural Steering Group, there's no one to do with sports or leisure on there. So I'm just getting a bit confused maybe, but can you just explain that?
The criteria that all applications were appraised on is 0.2.2 in the paper. So all applications were appraised on the same criteria and were given a score to be able to do that. Now, part of that includes the delivery of activity, the geography of delivery of activity. What we'd asked for, and we had to be quite careful about this, is what we'd asked for was ideally organisations that could deliver across the whole of Greater Manchester. That can be difficult for smaller organisations that we are putting relatively small amounts of money into for them to have the capacity to be able to go out across the whole of Greater Manchester. But what we do know is that the investment that we've put in will make sure that I think the delivery is and we will share some charts, the black and white at the moment and will mean nothing at all, but we'll share some charts that looks at the distribution of activity across Greater Manchester, and it's really quite level across the whole of Greater Manchester. We know of the investment that we've made, that is it 89% of all activity will be delivered across the entirety of Greater Manchester. So we very, very carefully built a portfolio that it is not City of Manchester focused, that it's focused across the whole of Greater Manchester, but obviously City of Manchester needs to benefit as well. In terms of governance, we're in a slightly different place because sport and this cultural portfolio at the moment don't line up, and we've got a piece of work to do to be able to bring that together. There is a huge amount of work going on around sports development across Greater Manchester, so it is something we're aware of. There is a governance structure for that and what we need to do, and it's just a matter of how we prioritise those things is to bring them together at some point. At the moment, because there's such a lot of work to do on the cultural strategy, we have focused our efforts on that, because actually the work going on with sport is going incredibly well without us interfering.
Thank you. I know you've got a follow-up on this.
My concern is most of our young people are very good at visual arts. Most of our young people are very savvy on digital, more so than we are. And I just wondered, how important is that going to be, Alison, within the strategy? Because I do think it's the way forward. You know, you go to galleries now and there's all this visual art, and I just wondered how you were going to build that in, and what companies have we got that you can actually tap into?
I couldn't thank you more for that question. That absolutely tees up the next report around digital strategy, and actually there is a link between the two, so we'll talk about in the next report, if that's okay.
So if I could sum up, actually, I mean, thank you first of all for a thorough report. Some very good answers, actually, and clearly you're not sitting on your laurels. You're thinking about the future and how things can improve, how things need to change, and I clearly welcome that. I think perhaps, going back to my observation at the start in terms of 632,000 has gone through Link for Life. Some of the question we've asked today might have been not asked if that analysis had been given, perhaps, and also an analysis of the success and failures by boroughs. So I think if we can circulate that as an action point to all members. I think the other point is clearly, I think around the table, there's a concern that consumers, residents are not involved enough in this, and I share that. I mean, that was going to be one of my questions. And I know it's not easy within the steering group. I thought that Kevin's idea of actually having a tier below was absolutely brilliant, and I would encourage you to think about that. I think that'd be very good, and you may have one person then from that, if that's formally, or two people formally on the steering committee, but of course you don't want the steering committee to be too wide, because large committees don't work in my judgment. The other thing I would suggest to you, that in the list of the members of the steering group, it's a wide list, but basically they're all administrators, or they're councillors, or they're heavily involved with the management of companies. There are a few performers, but there's another group of people actually who get involved with lots of organisations called trustees. I'm thinking of something like the Royal Northern College of Music. You could think of the Royal Exchange. You could think of Chetham's Music School. People like that, they're more like non-executive directors, so they have a thorough and deep interest and often knowledge of these sectors, but they're consumers as well. And it may just be that you might find, I mean, I could think of one of my old fellow partners actually who sang with the BBC Northern Choir, and he was a trustee of both the Royal Exchange and of Christie's, and I just think people like that. I mean, unfortunately, he's moved to London, but people like that could be very, very helpful, because they don't come with an agenda, and they come with a lot of thought. And I would suspect, a lot of sort of love for culture and art, in Greater Manchester generally. So I think if you can think about those things in particular going forwards, and I think that's important. And the other issue, of course, is the funding going forwards. And as we know, this is for 2 years. For the next 5 years, the next strategy development, I think the message you're probably getting across everybody here, that whilst we clearly would support some of the wonderful organisations we've got in Manchester, like the Halley, and nobody's mentioned the Lowry. I think the Lowry is absolutely fantastic. But also it is so important that we actually get more support out to, if you like, more grassroots levels of art And there's lots and lots of them across the whole of Greater Manchester. Some really good theatres, some itinerant groups, and it's very much, you know, a case that we all want to be spreading things as best we can do. But I know you can't find everybody, because there's no point giving everybody, you know, tuppence halfpenny. You know, you've got to give them something that's meaningful. So I think, you know, as part of the next funding round, in, as you say, in 2 years' time, I think that is something that I'm sure you will, of what you're saying, you know, will be considered. And I think that would be one of our recommendations, you know, to be noted down, actually. And if I could just check, make sure I've missed nothing else. One last point, absolutely delighted that you give them proper feedback. You can't actually, you know, replace that. That is so good. And people quite often, they miss the obvious things in application forms. And sometimes it's putting the right things in, the right sort of emphasis going into some of these applications. If you've given them that, you might well find, of course, that you've got even more deserving cases coming forward. So please keep that up. I think that's excellent. So we're asked, actually, to comment on the development and consultation process of the Greater Manchester Cultural Strategy. I think we've done that, and we've got some action points there. Provide views on the membership of the Greater Manchester Cultural Steering Group. Well, you very much have got some views there. And note the process implemented in the final beneficiary GMCA's Culture and Social Impact Fund. And I think, again, you've got some thought process there going forwards. So can I thank you once again, actually, for an excellent presentation and some really, really good answers to some excellent questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're now on to the digital strategy implementation update, and welcome to Susan.
I'm afraid it's me again, but yes, I will again try and keep presentation of the report relatively short to allow time for questions. What this report does is provide an update on progress of the Greater Manchester Digital Strategy. Members may remember that the draft digital strategy came to Scrutiny Committee, I think it was February this year, before adoption by the Combined Authority later on in February. I think absolutely taking Councillor Garrido's point, Greater Manchester's future success is absolutely dependent upon the adoption of digital, both within our businesses, but also by our residents, is absolutely critical to the success of the city region going forward. One of the things that's really, really important is that digital growth is inclusive. It's very easy to leave people behind. And one of the things that we wanted to focus on was being able to create a kind of make us digital with a difference, that it's not just kind of eyeballs out for economic growth. It was actually making sure that everybody is able to both benefit and access the changing world we're all moving into, and we're all moving pretty quickly as well. So the strategy itself, you may recall, was about set an ambition for Greater Manchester to become one of the best places in the world to be able to develop and harness digital technology, both in terms of creating growth, but also in terms of improving people's lives. And that's really, really, really important to us. What the strategy did, it set out the assets that we have, which are considerable, and the strengths that we have, which again are considerable. But it also set out some of the challenges that we've got as well. And some of those challenges are around talent, where our talent pipeline's coming from, and some of the challenges that our digital businesses are telling us they're having in terms of being able to attract talent. The ability to create digital public services going forward, both in terms of efficiency, but also in terms of economy as well. But actually the accessibility of some of those services could actually be more accessible if we are able to do them slightly differently. The importance of digital skills, and then how we tell our story. about how we tell our story as Greater Manchester is a city that is changing, and how we tell that story nationally to ourselves, but also internationally as well. If you think about how much Greater Manchester has changed, and I'll talk a little bit about the scale of inward investment that we're starting to see as well around digital and technology, and the change is remarkable. We just need to get better at telling people about that. The paper sets out a number of key facts about the scale of Greater Manchester's economy. I wasn't going to go through them in detail, but one of the things that is hugely important is we are the largest digital, creative and tech hub outside of London. We are considerably ahead of other places, and that's something that we are very proud of, and we want to be able to carry on growing. We are seeing huge increases in creative and digital skills. Again, that absolutely ties back to the creative skills that we're looking to be able to develop in our residents, particularly our young people, through investment in things like the Cultural Fund. One of the things it's worth pointing out is the scale of growth. Employment growth between 2010 and 2016, apologies for reading because this is quite an important one, for technology 42% employment growth, and for creative skills that's 20% employment growth in 6 years. That's too good not for us to be able to build on. We have lots of students here. Our universities are producing lots of graduates in relevant creative digital skills. One of the things there's been considerable investment in is investing really early on with children in primary schools being able to create code clubs, and about a quarter of our primary schools have code clubs that they're able to access now, which again, trying to get people, and particularly young people, engaged really, really early. We know that we have made considerable progress with our residents being able to develop some of those digital skills that everyone is going to need going forward. There is a disparity between those skills that they need and being able to, and actually using those skills. So we've got to be able to narrow that gap. Knowing how to do it and actually doing it are two slightly separate things. So we want to be able to work at that. In terms of some of the challenges we've got, we have a huge gender gap in technical roles, not just in Greater Manchester, it's common across the UK, and I hate to say this figure, but the ratio of men to women in technical roles is 79 to 21. And one of the areas that we really, really need to focus on is how we start to narrow that. We are losing some considerable opportunities not having more people, particularly women involved in tech. One of the areas where we've made considerable progress is in terms of the infrastructure. Digital technology is absolutely dependent on having a really strong infrastructure underpinning that, and we've made some real progress there. The strategy itself broke down into a number of different themes, and I was just going to quickly run through those different themes. In terms of the team delivering this as well, it is worth talking about the resource, because digital cuts across so many different areas of the Greater Manchester strategy. What we don't have is a digital team within the combined authority. What we have is, I was going to say ragbag, but that would be the wrong word. What we have is we've pulled teams from something called GM Connect that are very much focused on being able to align public data, to policy function, which is my area, to investment, and actually some of the skills that Transport for Greater Manchester have as well, in terms of infrastructure. So we've pulled a team together from a range of partners across Greater Manchester to be able to do this. Recognising the importance of this, the combined authority put an extra £200,000 in this year to be able to drive some of the big bids that we've done, but some of those big investments we need to do where actually some of it just needs a bit of money underneath it to push it along, and I can talk about that a little bit as well. In terms of infrastructure, hopefully you're aware of the fact that earlier in the year we won 23.8 million for local full fibre infrastructure, and that's about fibre to the premises. At the moment, the model is fibre to a cabinet, which is a green box down the end of everybody's road. From that green box, you've then got copper wire going from the green box to your house or to your business, which is fine, but the copper kind of slows it down. So it's super fast to the cabinet, and then it just kind of fades away. We've run, again, over 20 million to be able to invest in fibre to the premises. The way that we've done this is actually what we're looking to do is connect about 1,500 public sector premises to full fibre. And that's all sorts of complicated reasons why. But actually, first of all, there is huge public benefit to be able to do that. So some of those are public local authority buildings, a lot of those are schools, some of them are CCTV masts, but it's also to fire stations, and it's also particularly to GPs, surgeries as well. One of the things that is beneficial by connecting those public sector buildings, and those are across all 10 districts, and buildings are often found quite densely packed together. One of the things that's quite helpful with the way that works is the route that the fibre goes. The fibre will pass, I think it's about 110,000 businesses, and round about the same, no, considerably more residential properties. What that then does, because what we will not do is connect businesses, that's not our role to be able to connect businesses or properties, but it actually reduces some of the financial challenges that providers will have to do to be able to do that. So in effect, we're looking to open the market. One of the things that we're doing as well is making it easier for providers to be able to work anywhere within Greater Manchester consistently. At the moment, if you are a telecom provider, the rules in Stockport may well be different to the rules in Oldham about when and how you dig up the road, how you repair the road, and actually there's not a huge amount about aligning that dig. So actually, if there's other work going on, you can find parallel lines. It doesn't need to be like that. So there's a huge amount of work going on at the moment to be able to align that across Greater Manchester. That's what providers are telling us is the most expensive challenge that they have and the biggest barrier to them rolling out fibre in Greater Manchester. So we're looking to make that as straightforward and as easy as we can for them. What we expect to see from that is we are expecting to see from the investment that's being put in by DCMS and the match funding that's being put in by the public sector is we are expecting to see an overall investment of about £250 million by 2020. What that will take is our full fibre to the premises coverage from 2% to 25%. We will be ahead of the rest of the UK by 2020, and that's our ambition.
So if you're seeing a school here and GP surgery there being connected like that, there's a good reason for it. It is about optimising the reach of the network to make certain that we can capitalise and make as many residents and businesses benefit from the core infrastructure as we can.
Absolutely. Again, the fibre infrastructure is critical to be able to connect homes, but also for what comes next. And the next generation of mobile connectivity, 5G, it's actually something called 4.5G. But then there is 5G, which is coming next. It's completely different. It's not just faster. 5G will enable driverless vehicles. It will enable a huge number of our ambitions around health and social care, but also, in effect, connectivity will be everywhere. At that point, you can then get your fridge that talks to you, but actually you then start to get into some really interesting sensor technology that looks to protect people in their homes, and a whole range of different things. So it's hugely important, but you cannot do that without the fibre that underpins that. We did bid over the summer for a national pilot for 5G. We were not successful. One of the things that's been really interesting is 47 partners came together to work on that bid. All 47 partners have said, don't care if we won or lost, we want to do it anyway. So we are working with those partners now to be able to see what we can do outside of this funding round. Actually, I think we can do a huge amount, and we'll happily bring progress on that back to you probably in 6 months when we've made more progress. One of the other areas that's hugely important and probably the most critical is around skills and talent. We know that businesses are telling us that they're not able to attract the tech and the digital talent that they want. And we know that particularly with the curriculum, there are some challenges making sure schools have the capacity to be able to offer computer science, for example, at GCSE and at A-level. So one of the areas that we are looking to focus on is a couple of different projects. One that's going out to tender, I think it's opened now or shortly about to open. So I need to be let me give you a little bit of detail, but not too much. So we're looking at £2 million worth of investment from Greater Manchester Combined Authority. And what that will do is create a digital talent pipeline programme. Two bits of it, one around discovering digital skills, so that's working in schools with young people. The second part is an education digital industry programme. Now that's about how we're able to build links between schools and those tech businesses. Absolutely, Councillor Guido's point about how we're able to link those two things together. One of the things that's really important as well is as technology is moving so quickly, it's actually making sure that teachers are able to have those skills, because often the things that they learn will be redundant within 18 months. So it's a huge amount of work looking at how we build a kind of CPD programme for teachers so they're actually able to keep up with the latest technological innovations, but also how they understand the demand for technical skills within Greater Manchester and beyond. So actually the skills that they are teaching are relevant as those young people come out of school into our business space, but also more widely as well. In terms of the next priority around growth and productivity, again, what we've looked to do and what our partners, the Growth Company, have done is invested in programs to be able to support businesses, digital businesses to grow more quickly, but also businesses to digitise. And particularly around manufacturing businesses. And you may have heard of Industry 4.0. We will get to a point very quickly where there is probably no part of the economy that's not going to be touched by this. And there is something about not being left behind that's hugely important with this. One of the areas, there is a programme that they've delivered very, very successfully, some detail in the report, and they are looking to be able to expand that, and I think that will start in October. One of the things I wanted to mention as well is around the work that Midas, the Inward Investment Agency, are doing. We are seeing considerable interest in inward investment, and I think actually since this report was written and completed a week ago, there's been some more. But in terms of inward investment into Manchester, some of those, particularly important announcement around Jaguar Land Rover, who've wanted to move their IT kind of engineering research division into Greater Manchester, which is hugely important. ARM, that you'll be aware of, who develop the chips that sit in mobile phones and just about every device that you plug in, are expanding their presence in Greater Manchester as well. Hut Group, which is an online organisation, expanding their presence. And Tech Mahindra, which is an Indian company, are locating here as well. We understand from Midas there is an even stronger pipeline coming forwards. So what we're expecting to see is more coming through. I think it was earlier this week, we were also found out that Booking.com are taking a really large presence, actually just outside of Spinningfields in the city centre as well. So I think increasingly with the universities and the number of people that we have who are able to work in this space, we're seen as an attractive place to be able to invest. In terms of a digital inclusion, you may be aware of something called IDEA, which is the Duke of Edinburgh, Duke of York's Digital Enterprise Award. It's a fantastic initiative to be able to, it's a good thing to do as well. It's to be able to give the workforce and young people some of those digital skills that they need. There is a link in here to the website. I would absolutely encourage you to encourage as many people as you can to do it. It's a really great way to be able to look at digital, and particularly digital enterprise, which plus the fact it's good fun. I think there is a lot more that we need to do in this space, but this is one of those ways that you can get significant numbers picking up those skills that they need just to kind of start people off. In terms of marketing communications, again, I said at the start, one of the things that's really important is we get better at telling our story. So one of the ambitions in the digital strategy was to host an international event. One of the things that we've never done is hosted an international event around digital and tech events, something like South by Southwest that you might be aware of. We have commissioned an organisation called Future Everything that some of you might be aware of to do some work for us to be able to look at what that would be. And again, we would want it to be to fit with the principles of digital with a difference. This isn't just about the latest robots or whatever. It's actually about the social benefit that will provide. There is quite a lot of work going on that we would look hopefully to be able to bring to you in our next update, working with our comms team and with Market in Manchester, so we better understand what messages will resonate and who our audiences are, and we'd look to be able to share that with you next time we come, so you can see how we get better at telling our story. Public service digitisation, and I'm sorry, I will stop speaking in a minute. So there is an enormous amount of work going on. Again, recognising the advantage that we have in some of the devolution deals that we have, that we can work much more closely and in partnership with other bits of the public sector than maybe other places can. Particularly health and social care is where we're making real progress. There is a big programme of health and social care digitisation going on at the moment. We've recently been successful in winning a £7 million investment into what's called a local health record exemplar. So it's actually about how we are able to get our electronic healthcare records in a much better position than they are currently. There is something as well about, and I'm sorry, this gets a bit geeky, but a common architecture. We've got lots of different systems in all sorts of different organisations. Not all of them speak to each other. There is something really, really important about getting that architecture right, and there is a significant focus on that at the moment. One of the things that is really, really important is, while we are talking about data, this is people's data. So there is a piece of work going on, a resident engagement piece at the moment, to understand people's attitudes to how we use their data. It is, as a public sector, hugely important that we can share people's data. It saves 3 or 4 different organisations knocking on somebody's door asking the same question. But equally, it's about how we use that data, and if people, individuals, are happy for us to use that data, and if they are, that they are comfortable that we use it securely. There are a couple of pilots that are going on around that as well at the moment. I'm going to stop shortly, but one of the things that we've made considerable progress on is cyber. Greater Manchester is increasingly being recognised as a real hub for investment and growth in cybersecurity. You'll be aware of the recent announcement from GCHQ. What we have followed that up with is further investment in a facility that SMEs and small companies who are small cyber companies are able to grow and to be able to work together. And we've recently won about 6 million of ERDF and local funding to create something called a cyber Foundry, which is to be able to work, link some of the research that our universities and also Lancaster University, who occupies the space really well, how we're able to get that research into our business space as well. So we're trying to align investment to be able to grow on that original GCHQ confidence in Greater Manchester. One of the challenges we have is how we measure our success. We've done quite a bit of work on trying to understand how we measure our success. This is really, really quite difficult, because although we can measure individual things we've done, so something moves from 36 to 97, It only matters if we know where we fit comparatively with other places. Because actually 97 might mean nothing when everyone else is at 106. We are doing some work both with government and with Nesta, who produced a Digital Cities Index and are no longer doing it, but with a range of other organisations and other cities to see can we build a set of measures that are comparative that we will all use, because if we all use two, they will both be wrong. So is there a set of measures we can all use so we're all able to measure progress? What I hope to do is to be able to report back the next time we come back in 6 months about how we've done with that. It's a real challenge for us, but it's really important we measure how we've done. I will stop speaking.
Before I throw out the questions, thank you for a very detailed report, and clearly there's a lot going on, a lot of good news, particularly the inward investment. One of my main question was going to be about performance, I have to say, and I recognise what you're saying in terms of the difficulty of what you actually measure and how to measure it. And I seem to recall last year you were looking at a Nesta framework for using that for, if you like, almost a benchmark for measurements. And there were difficulties, so I understand the difficulty you have got. But it is important, I think, for going forward, so that we understand, if you like, either how you're comparing with a target, what's the direction it travels, or do some RAG rating. But it is important that we don't lose sight of, if you like, where we're trying to get to and where we are on that pathway. So, but I'm pushing it now to questions. And then Charles, and then Susan.
Thanks, Chair. Where I live, it's quite a suburban area, but even now, coverage of 4G isn't very good. And I know not all of Greater Manchester is suburban or urban. I just wondered what plans there are to... Obviously, it's more difficult to provide high-speed internet connections and so on in the rural areas because the economics don't work out. But I just wondered, are there any plans for extending it into the more rural parts of Greater Manchester? Because obviously there are people there, individuals who want to work from home or set up small businesses and don't want to move into the middle of Manchester or to Trafford Park or somewhere. So I just wondered, are there any plans really to try and, presumably we need some sort of financial support to get the companies to extend high-speed coverage into rural areas?
The challenge, I absolutely take your point, and there are areas in Greater Manchester, particularly rural areas, that have really, really poor coverage. Part of the challenge is the funding that's available, particularly national funding, to be able to do that. We are aware that DCMS are looking to do a rural programme that is similar to the programme that we won 23 million for. We will certainly be looking at that. One of the other areas that's worth bearing in mind is actually there might be a way to leapfrog some of this in those areas that have already got really poor connectivity. There are a range of different ways to give people internet access in rural areas, and it's one of those areas as part of our kind of ongoing discussion with providers to see how we can do that. Part of what we can't say is because it does cost. You know, if it is about putting fibre in, there is a big cost with that. So we're looking at alternatives, but it will be dependent on being able to identify funding, but it's something we're acutely aware of.
Charles.
Part of the question was similar to what Barry's just said, because even after the rollout, we've still got areas over in Wigan that won't be connected. So it's an ongoing problem. The other thing is the bid that we was unsuccessful with, what feedback did we get? Because if you read the first part about all our experts, and then we go into a bidding process and fail, what feedback did we get that we could, lessons learned to move forward?
In terms of the 5G feedback that we've got, it's been relatively limited. But what we've had is that we'd focused really, really heavily on the purpose of 5G and a lot less on the technology of 5G. And that's in part because we took a view that actually the industry have much more expertise in this space than we do, and actually our focus needs to be, well, what do we want it for? The feedback that we got is actually they wanted much more of technical input than we put into that. Having said that, and always trying to find a positive in this, is actually the partnership that came together to be able to do that have kind of said, well, those priorities that we've identified are still our priorities. Those are still things that we want to do. Actually, let's talk to industry about the technical side about how you do that. But it sends still, there is still a very strong view that actually we can do this anyway. So there is quite a bit of work ongoing at the moment to scope what that could be, and part of that is because of the attraction of Greater Manchester to providers, to the new 5G providers who've paid, I think it's £1.3 billion for the spectrum earlier in this year. They really, really need to see a return on their investment. So they're very keen to work in a city that is well connected, that has governance that they can understand and that they can engage with. So that's one of the areas that we will look to carry on with.
Sam, you want to add something then?
Yeah, it's just really on the point about internet speeds across the across the conurbation. Alison picked up in her kind of introductory remarks, but there is pretty strict restrictions on what the public sector can do in this space, mainly defined by the European Union, actually. And therefore, we're doing effectively two things. Firstly, we are making sure that we're working, as Alison mentioned, this kind of one dig approach, which is actually, if we can make it easy for the private sector to come in and put fibre within Greater Manchester, then actually that was what we make the biggest difference. We can't invest ourselves directly other than connecting public sector premises, but actually if we can get the private sector, if we can make it easy for the private sector to invest in Greater Manchester, that's what will lead to the fastest rollout of faster speeds and ultimately to fibre across the biggest part of Greater Manchester.
Can I just...
Of course, Charles.
Yeah, all it is we're talking now that we're moving forward after failing with that bid. So discussions are going on. Will the areas be involved in that discussion to enhance our chance of 5G?
I think it depends on what we've got to, what we want to be able to do is to be able to say to providers, these are the assets that we have. Which of those assets are you interested in? Now, part of that will be, again, we will get to a point that 5G is as ubiquitous as hopefully 4G almost is, and 3G pretty much is now. But so this is kind of early stage stuff. I think where they will want to focus is in areas where there are very dense populations, whether that's business populations or whether that's communities. But there are a number of significant assets that we have that other places don't have, that I think they would have an interest in. So part of what we've got to do is to kind of create, and I'm sorry I'm being cagey, but part of what we've got to do is almost create a portfolio, take that to industry, almost as part of a procurement exercise to say, do you want to partner with us on this, this and this? And what we would want to be able to do, again, this is about digital with a difference. This isn't about, it might be a particular asset in a particular place, but we need the benefit to be felt as widely as we possibly can. Until we are kind of a little bit closer to being able to, part of what we've got to do is put value on some of those assets. The public sector isn't always great at being able to value its assets. So part of what we've got to do some more work to be able to value those, and then we will know the impact that we're expecting from the private sector. I'm sorry, that's a really difficult way to try and answer your question.
Susan.
Thanks, Chair. Want to look to what you said about jobs. One thing that came up was you referred to that point in time earlier this year when the companies, the digital companies, reported that around 20% of their posts that, if I remember, were, I think the finance offer must have been around 40,000. I looked at them. I don't know whether they were calling them level 4 or level 5 positions, but they weren't filling them. And that is, you identified, of course, there's a lack of, if you like, digitally educated, digitally skilled people, obviously in this conurbation to have applied for them. And you talked to us about the GMCA's work, perhaps with partners, looking at GCSEs. And you also talked about this digital talent pipeline programme. Some of that does feel a bit medium to long term. where would it be then at the GMCA where there might be a bit more of a honing in on whether any of that percentage gap, 20%, can be achieved, and perhaps even if we can drive that figure down, people might be doing it now within the next year or so on. And I want to view as well, you see, if we start to fill those jobs, is it not surely going to release some of the other jobs, if I can call it, in a jobs pipeline, where we might just have slightly better skilled people, where we can start getting them into the jobs that then become free? Because, you know, if you look across the sector, that can often happen. You just upskill one set and then you can start to backfill. And for a town like mine that's not always great on the skills, we've got some gaps, the backfill jobs really stand out. So I've added that on because it's of interest to me. But really it's about what's the GMCA doing more in the short to medium term, or the short term even, on that 20% gap, please?
So, can I introduce my colleague Helen Wilding, who's actually the person who's done a dizzying amount of work on this. So if I could get her to answer the question directly.
Thank you. First of all, just a bit of an explanation of that. I think it's a 27% figure that's in the paper. That is based on a survey that Manchester Digital, the sort of trade organisation for digital companies, a survey that it did of its members. It's got about 500 members. So they were sort of reporting whether they'd had to turn away work based on not having the right skills and talent. So as you say, the medium to long term pipeline with kind of young people, there's a lot of activity going on in there. I think on the more short term, I think there's probably two things that I'd kind of highlight where I think that will help in that respect. And obviously, this is a kind of market economy. We're not sort of seeking to kind of put our hands all over that. But I think firstly, this is where the economic impact of the gender equality target really comes in, because you are kind of, and that has a long tail element to it too around young people. But there's a really important part of that is around just us not utilising the talent that is already out there, whether that is in other professions or not working or whatever. And so one of the things we're kind of looking at around that gender equality target is the issue of career changers, returners to work. And I think that could form potentially, if we get that right, that could form a significant part of filling those gaps in the kind of much shorter term. And there are kind of programmes out there in Greater Manchester that sort of are already focusing on that sort of thing, where people who are already in associated professions that want to get into tech but don't know how, people who've had career breaks, that sort of thing. So we're working and talking to those organisations to see what we may be able to do there. I think the other area is actually the kind of digitisation of the general business base, the sort of all other sectors, in the sense that you kind of, if the work that is going on to do that just raises the overall level of talent in the system, and then the overall level of options that people have got. So it's not necessarily a question of people coming directly through on one route. People could be crossing over from manufacturing, engineering, accountancy, retail. So I think the work that the growth company in particular is starting to do to look at digitisation of all businesses is going to be really important there. And just to say a little bit about that, the way they are starting to rethink, and this is early on, is their approach with general businesses rather than digital businesses to date has been quite heavily focused on digital marketing, reflecting the demand that they've had, but what they've been doing as well. So setting up websites, using social media, so thinking about using digital to sell, and the shift that we're trying to get to is those companies, and it's not just manufacturing by any means, thinking about digital to design, to create, to do all these other things, rather than just thinking everything else I just do as I did before, but I sell it digitally. And that's the kind of mindset shift that we need to achieve across all sectors. So I think both of those two things are at least a part of the answer to the short-term question.
Do you want to follow up on that, or are you happy with that answer? Okay.
Thank you, Chair. I share your concerns about the ratio of women to men in the technology. It's quite concerning to me, given the talent pool that we've got in Greater Manchester. And I suppose my comments, there's twofold issues here. My comments is about, are we being proactive in kind of addressing this? And what is it that stops women coming into that industry? You know, are we doing a bit of a analysis of what the kind of prohibitors are? Why aren't women sort of finding that that career sort of attractive, or are not retaining in that career? My other issue, which I bang on about a lot because I will, is the challenge that Greater Manchester have around our older workforce and the digital inclusion agenda around older people. And I say I am an older person, over 50, so that is the definition. So there's a lot of people in employment who are not benefiting from digital inclusion, and I think that's a real concern, and it's a growing concern, I think, in Greater Manchester in terms of employability. And I suppose what I would be interested to hear is how we incentivising our employers to develop those digital skills of the workforce, so that people can retain, retrain, etc., that you mentioned, Helen. That's my kind of two-pronged question. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to kind of come back on the last one first, I don't think there necessarily is perhaps enough of a link being made yet between all the work that GM does on ageing and all the work that it does on digital, and that's something we can sort of take away and think about. I think indirectly it is being picked up in the sense that some of the areas and some of the sectors that we know we need to kind of focus on and concentrate on are those ones that tend to have an average higher employment age. So we know manufacturing is a higher employment age, for example. There's stuff in healthcare as well. So I think sort of indirectly it's being picked up on, but perhaps not explicitly. And I think there is a crossover to the gender stuff that we might want to think about a bit more as well. You know, part of the returners' career changes in the gender space could well be sort of women over 50 who sort of, you know, never got the chance to do this the first time round, so to speak. And so I think it is something we can kind of take away that link and think about a little bit more. And it will be picked up on very much in the inclusion space, but perhaps less so in the employment space. On the first question around just to sort of play back, are we kind of being proactive enough, and kind of what do we know about why this happens? I think we're being considerably more proactive than we ever have been. The Mayor has spoken about it quite a bit. He has personally met with representatives of the digital sector, the digital community, to talk about this issue, and has kind of charged or challenged them to come back with, tell me what you want us to do. And so that's the kind of work that's going on at the moment, and we're speaking to various organisations to try and develop some specific things that we could do. I think he's also been involved with initiatives like the Equality and Human Rights Commission Working Forward agenda, which is not specifically to do with digital, but is about pregnancy and maternity related discrimination, which we know causes lots of sort of lost economic activity in the economy. So I think it's sort of, there's always more you could do, but I think we're probably in a space where we're being more explicit and proactive about this than we have been before. And it's very much based in an economic and a social imperative. You know, this is kind of, there is increasingly explicit evidence about the economic benefit or the opportunity cost of not having equality and having occupational segregation in sectors, partly because of the talent thing, and partly because you just don't design as good products and services if all the people designing them look and sound and talk and are from the same place, regardless of what that place is. There's lots of opportunities where products have got all the way down the line and then somebody's gone, oh, hang on, nobody thought about this. because we were all 45-year-old white men, for example. So there's a real economic imperative as well as the just equality. It is the right thing to do. So I think there is a lot of activity in this space. In terms of why it happens, we know it starts from birth, and we know it continues all the way along. So it's quite sort of heavily, girls and women are kind of quite heavily socialised away from this, these types of careers from a very early age, which is why we need to do so much at the younger age. But we also know that there is a point where it really starts to become acute, that you start to lose girls and young women from these subjects, which is around about year 8, year 9. And we also know that it's not remotely innate, and this changes over time. Until the 70s, computer programming was an entirely female-dominated profession, and it only started to really change in the 80s. So this is not something that's kind of been going in the same direction the whole time. It is entirely reversible. And we're not, also, just finally, Greater Manchester isn't drastically worse than anywhere else in the country. The UK average is kind of 81 to 19 on that stat you saw in the report. Interestingly, the best places in the country are South West Scotland and Cumbria. We have no idea why, but there it is.
Danny.
My question's already roundabout been answered, to be honest, in regards to when you see the green boxes, and always, especially around our way, I don't want to start a Brexit debate again, like I just said before, but you see a lot of, the EU flag on them saying that the EU is invested in fibre technology, and I know that you've answered the question with private enterprises picking it up, but it'd be nice to see that it is done fairly across the whole of Greater Manchester, and not just where the money is going to be made. I just wanted to make that comment. Also, I did leave the room, so I am sorry if this did get brought up, but I don't understand this table. Can you just quickly explain it to me?
This arose from a question I raised yesterday, actually. In other words, when Portugal's got 6% coverage and Greater Manchester's got 2% coverage, well, Portugal's a different sort of... Oh, sorry, the UK's got 2% coverage. Portugal's a different sort of country. So it was really to show comparatives with other countries, and it's still not good reading. But I'll let the experts answer.
Stand the abbreviations on it either, sorry.
The thing to look at is the thing to look at is really the total height of the bars. Don't worry sort of too much about the division between the two, because increasingly people's businesses are in their premises anyway. So it's the total height of the bar is the thing there. And what's quite interesting about this chart is not just the obvious about where we are, but the kind of mixture of countries who are at the top versus the bottom. There's no particular kind of pattern you can pick out as to say, well, Southern Europe are all up here and Eastern Europe are all down here, or vice versa. It's quite an interesting kind of chart in that respect, and we probably have quite a bit to learn about how much of that is about history and national culture and things that are kind of difficult to replicate, and how much of it is about policy choices and funding decisions and political will, which are easier to replicate, sort of. Is the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development. So it's basically, it's a list of the sort of developed countries, basically. So when you're doing sort of comparisons between countries on this sort of thing, or economic type indicators, it just gives you a basket of countries that are sort of more or less like you to give a meaningful comparison.
So I'll just pick up a couple of final questions then. If it's one short question, we actually need to move on. We're running out of time.
Sorry,
and then
yeah.
I'll come up to
this,
mine.
this is a fascinating graph, isn't it? And I just wonder, in practice, what is a person in Japan doing that I'm not?
Just picking it up on this, I mean, it is interesting what you're saying. I mean, if you take out Korea and Japan, and they've always been ahead of the game in electronics and everything else, but we're comparable, you know, in terms of businesses with Germany. And I don't understand. I'm sure that it's so difficult to understand. But the clear thing is, I mean, that more and more people are working for themselves. They're working at home. And if you want to improve productivity, which is one of the key drivers for what we need in our economy, it's to improve on fibre broadband. And I find what we're doing, you know, getting ahead of the game is great. But it's the whole country. And I don't fully, I'm glad to say you don't understand it, but it's something that needs to be addressed, albeit it's the private sector that does it, it's not the public sector. But I just wonder what governments, my government, should be doing about this. So I can make a political point about it, and I think it is important that more investment goes into fibre broadband, because that is the future. And as you say, with 3G as well, you know, we've got to move onwards. My next question, actually, which was related to, and I was intrigued by this one, on the latest key facts. And you've got 220 primary school code clubs. Now, as I understand it, before long, in the years to come, in a fairly short period of time, coding is going to be as important almost as the 3 Rs. Every child will be taught coding, because it's absolutely central, you know, to the digital development. And my question was, I mean, I can't judge if 220 is great. It's disappointing. But what are we doing to try and promote, if you like, schools, or encourage schools to actually, you know, push forward these coding clubs more and more, but recognising that the skills that they may have in school, in many schools, may not be actually, you know, appropriate for doing such things.
Right, I shall try and answer both questions. Actually, we'll both try and answer both questions. In terms of the first point about fibre rollout, I completely agree. I think one of the constraints has been around some issues around state aid, and about how public sector investment can go into fibre. So I think there's been a reliance on the private sector to be able to do this. The local full fibre network, the £23 million programme that we have, actually allows us to connect public sector premises, so that means we are not constrained by state aid. So it's trying to find creative ways around that. So to be fair, I think government is trying to find a way to do this, but because the telecoms providers are private companies, we've got to find a way to make it easier for them to do it, because there isn't a nationalised organisation that does this. So they are all private. So we've got to find a way to make it easier for them. And that's why, as Simon said, this kind of one dig prospectus thing is hugely important.
So therefore, if we were outside of the common market, sorry, the European Union, and therefore we could, if it was appropriate, give state aid, then that may be a way forward.
I'm afraid not, because one of the things that, at the moment anyway, the government is planning to do is to comply with European state aid rules, even once we've left the European Union.
Well, it depends on what customs agreement we have in the end of the day. And I mean, a lot of people want, but obviously not to be bound by that.
Yeah, so to put that in context, which isn't in the paper, that's about a quarter of Greater Manchester primary schools. So it's sort of, you know, it could be much better, but it is not bad. And some of the activity that's talked about in the paper and that skills colleagues are working on through getting industry into schools is helping with that. I think. So probably two things to say. One, again, without making a political point, quite a lot of the levers that Greater Manchester can employ have to be extracurricular rather than around sort of reformatting the curriculum, which is why the sort of things like kind of code clubs are sort of being kind of focused on. I think the second thing to say as well is that, and if my skills colleagues were here, they would be saying it, but is we can get quite kind of hung up on coding as being the kind of the only thing and the most important thing. So I think coding is important and it's sort of part of it, but it's equally important that we have really good maths attainment, that we have really good tangential skills around that are sort of creative, hence the kind of link with all the kind of cultural stuff that are around problem solving and all those sorts of things. So I think we could do more on the coded clubs, but it's not just about code clubs, I suppose, is what the point I would make.
No, I appreciate that. Entirely. It's not just about coding clubs, but it's an element of things. Good. So,
can I just quickly? Sorry. Can I just quickly say something about that? This is once frivolous and yet also serious. Won't artificial intelligence make the learning of coding redundant before too long?
That's a very good question that I don't know whether I can answer. But it plays to points that have been raised earlier about how one of the challenges for us is how do we keep up with the incredibly fast-moving nature of this in the public sector, and even industry sort of is struggling to kind of keep up with the fast-moving nature of this. It also shows why taking an approach to digital that is not just narrowly economic, but thinks about what are the implications of this for sort of society, the future of work, all of that sort of thing, which we're trying to do is really important, because we are sort of all the time trying to think, well, what is the impact on kind of people in all of this, which is not exactly an answer to your question, but it is something we're very aware of.
Right, so just finally, thanks for clarifying that again, and that perhaps I'm being unfair on the government for what you were saying. So, so thanks for educating me in terms of what has happened around state aid. I think we've actually come to the conclusion on this, and I think again we're asked to review and provide feedback on the action taken to implement the strategy since approval in February this year. I think we've given you various things. I think in particular, I think equality or inequality, particularly with regards to older people and women, I think it's a very important point for you to pick up. And if in your next report you can bring something back on that in terms of initiatives or what you're doing on that. And then the other thing I think clearly is having, if you like, a proper RAD-rated reporting in terms of what your objectives are. And I do understand in terms of getting the KPIs you need, it is difficult. It's not easy. But there's a lot going on. And I think we're in a good position in Manchester. So well done for that. And finally, we're on to the work programme.
Okay, very briefly, not too much to say here. If any members have got any particular issues that they wish to raise on the prospective items for next month, can you email them in to me? That would be really great. Been listening with great interest to members' comments on gender equality and kind of factoring it into the item that is scheduled for February. So we are, and I will be in contact with members about that. The only other thing of note is our November meeting looks to be very congested, and so we're asking for it to be extended for half an hour. So we've got it down for 4:30. I don't know whether it's possible for 1:30, whether the 4:30 or 1:30 would be better for people. I'm not sure.
Any thoughts? I'm not fussed either way. You always tend to arrive by 1:30 anyway, so that'd be good news. And I think the key thing is, because the mayor's coming to that meeting, I don't want to put any sort of constraint on the amount of time that we need with the mayor, basically. So if we can do that, that'd be good news. And then finally, we've got...
No, sorry, there's somebody...
Sorry, I missed that, sorry.
Might we ask for more concise reports? Perhaps that would help to keep the timing tighter.
And then finally, we've got two items of information only. Their linkages are obviously in the reports to the Brexit Monitor and the Register of Key Decisions. And then finally, the next meeting is on the 21st of September. Yep, okay, 21st. You've all been notified, but that's a new date. Unfortunately, neither I nor the Vice Chair can make that meeting, which is unfortunate. So, but I assure you that there will not be any more changes for meetings over the next year. Thank you.